The entire contents of this podcast and website are based upon the opinions of Tammy Garcia and her guests, unless otherwise noted. The information on this podcast is not intended to replace a one-on-one relationship with a qualified healthcare professional and is not intended as medical advice. It is intended as a sharing of knowledge and information from the research and experience of Tammy Garcia and her guests. This is the Naturally Inspired Podcast, coming to you from our 1890 homestead in Johnstown, Colorado. I'm Tammy, and I want to thank you for joining us. Let's get started and help people feel good so they can do what they love for longer. Today on the Naturally Inspired Podcast, Kevin Annett is joining us. Kevin is a renowned global human rights campaigner. He's an author and a whistleblower who has led the movement to expose and prosecute child murder by church and state in Canada and Europe. Kevin is the co-founder of the International Tribunal of Crimes of Church and State organization, and he has been nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. Kevin graduated from University of British Columbia with a bachelor's degree in anthropology and a master's degree in political science. In 1990, he graduated from the Vancouver School of Divinity. He's authored 17 books. He's produced a documentary called Unrepented, which is about genocide in Canada. And that movie won in 2006 an award for Best Director at the New York International Independent Film Festival. So I think it's safe to say that Kevin has dedicated his life to justice for crimes against humanity. He has suffered great personal sacrifices in the name of truth, as one often does when they go against the establishment. Smear campaigns and efforts to discredit his character have never stopped him, and he still moves forward today. In his words, Kevin said, "Just keep standing on the truth. And when you do that, miracles can happen." So I hope you enjoy this episode number 41 with Kevin Annett. Thank you so much for coming on the Naturally Inspired Podcast today. I've learned a ton of stuff in a short amount of time that I've heard your name. Just hearing your name, I've dove into a little bit of a lot of your interviews, and I've looked at a few of your books and just kind of had my mind opened up to what Canada's really like, and being born and raised in Victoria, BC, and living in Canada for 25 years. I can't believe what I didn't know.
Yeah. Well, that's often true with people in their own country, Tammy. I remember my partner, Carol, she taught for many years in Japan. And in the school curriculum in Japan, they never mentioned before World War II, Japan had invaded China and they killed about 10 million people there. And none of that is ever mentioned in the Japanese textbooks in school.
Right.
And if you mention it, they say, "Oh, you're just working for the Chinese, you're trying to destroy our society." The same response I got in Canada when I began to bring out this hard evidence that tens of thousands of children had been deliberately killed in these Indian boarding schools, which we also had in America. But they weren't as bad and as widespread as they were in Canada. For over 120 years, these places, they killed over 60,000 children, and we're using methods like deliberately putting children together, the sick and the healthy, so they'd catch TB and then never treat them. That kind of germ warfare, it was standard practice at every level of government and church, and the courts, they all supported this. So when a society planned and carried out genocide, they're not going to ever prosecute themselves. In fact, they're going to try to excuse it. And it's interesting because that's exactly what's going on now.
Right.
Because mandatory vaccinations are the norm and have been for 120 years for Indians.
Yeah.
Under the Indian Act of Canada, you can't refuse vaccinations or medical treatment on reservation.
So what does that mean, that the health department can go right onto a reservation and just do a mass vaccination, and nobody can deny it on the reservation?
That's one of the things. When I was a clergyman on the West Coast of Canada in the 1990s, Native women were continually coming to me in Port Alberni on Vancouver Island and saying that the health department people were showing up, literally knocking the door in holding the mothers and parent and fathers away and shoving needles in the arms of the children. And whenever they wanted to test out a new drug, I remember when the Tamiflu thing happened, or the H1N1 swine flu virus,
Yeah.
they the first area declared a pandemic zone was one of the most isolated Indian reservations on Vancouver Island, the Ahousaht Nation near
Okay.
Tofino, and that's because they had experimented with them, the Tamiflu drug on them, and they had all gotten sick from it. And so, I mean, these methods have been used against other people a lot, and now they're extending them to all of us. And
Right.
so, in a way, it's nothing new, but it is for people who don't know, the society they live in, which is all of us at some point have
Right.
come out
Like,
of that
I
ignorance,
think
right?
most people I know, if they knew that was happening on a reservation, would be horrified.
Yeah.
Horrified that someone could go in and just force vaccinate your children.
Well, no, in America, it's different. They can't as easily do that because American Indians were given the right to become full citizens back in 1924. And reservations in America are kind of like the same status as Puerto Rico. They're considered dependencies of the
Okay.
federal government, but there's some autonomy. Native people can bring in their own laws. But in Canada, you're literal slaves. They're called wards of the state under the Indian Act,
Hmm.
wards of the crown. It means you're like a child or a mentally incompetent person on reservation. You can't even open a bank account or make a renovation to your home without permission from the government. And it's a second category of citizenship. They're not citizens, and that's why often in Canadian newspapers you'll see of like police will have shot an Indian or beaten them to death in a jail cell or taking them outside town in winter and dumping them, and they never get prosecuted because you can do that to a group of people that aren't included under the law, like an expendable group, like Indians under the Indian Act. And so,
Right.
um, once the old saying, if anyone is injured, it really injures all of us because those methods can then be used against anybody, right?
Right. It's interesting because that's not my understanding of it. Like, for some reason, my understanding was that reservations were sovereign.
No, no. If you look in the Indian Act, it says all land is vested in the crown. So this was an old British tactic. They used, the British Empire did this all over the world. They would go in, grab an land, like in Ireland, where my ancestors are from. They did
Yeah.
this. They would grab the land, and then they would appoint local tribal chiefs to administer the land for the crown. That's what Indian chiefs do on reservations. They don't own their own land; they're administering it for this fiction called the Crown of England, right?
Right.
And that claims ownership of everything in Canada. So you're never taught this stuff in school, of course, because
No,
it might start
of
people
course not.
asking questions, right?
Right. That's what's so I think that's kind of the issue that we're dealing with today is
Yeah,
is when we start talking about distrust when it comes to the government, it becomes so unbelievable to
yeah,
people. Well, why would they
yeah.
do that? Why would they do that? That's the question when I'm having conversations with people. It doesn't add up in people's heads. Why would they do that? Um, but they do.
Well, that's because we've been raised with the idea that we kind of like human beings tend to project either our own light or our own shadow on authority.
Right.
So we're kind of raised with the idea that people are in power because they're virtuous and they've got the public interest at heart. And in fact, when you look at the way it operates, it's exactly the opposite.
Right.
Because the people who tend to rise to the top of corporate hierarchies, whether it's government or churches or anything, tend to be the most ruthless.
Right.
Um, it kind of selects for sociopathic individuals. So then everybody down the chain has to do the same thing if they want to keep their job.
Right.
And that's why I remember there was this famous incident that happened right after World War II where Robert Jackson, he was the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials when the Nazis were on trial for war crimes. And he was speaking to a Jewish congregation in Brooklyn. And he scandalized everyone there because he said, the SS were no different than you and I. If you put yourself in that situation, we could very easily have done the same thing. We're just people who are influenced by the systems of power that we're locked in, and we feel we can't say no to them.
Right.
And that's the dilemma that we're in right now because these COVID measures come along and they don't make any sense.
Right.
They actually
Right.
make you unhealthy, they're unlawful,
That's right.
um, and yet people go along with them, even though again goes against reason and their own self-interest
Right.
because everybody else is doing it. So it's partly that herd instinct, but it's also I think we're being targeted by real psychological warfare methods here.
Yes, I
You
agree.
know, Yeah.
It's there's so much gaslighting going on,
Yeah.
2 and 2 is 5. No, it really is, if you say it as many times,
Right.
you get people to follow that because you're
Yeah.
right, nothing adds up,
Yeah.
we're talking about a 99 plus percent recovery rate here.
No, it's insane.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. So a little bit about you. How did you kinda get on this path? Where did you go to school? Where did you grow up?
Well, I'm from the prairies in Canada, around Winnipeg. We're descendants of Scottish Irish settlers who came there in the 1800s, and we intermarried with the local Korean Ojibwe Indians. Although nobody in the family ever talked about that till I began to do this work, right?
Right.
You don't want to talk about that side of the family, right? But it was interesting.
That's my nana was like
Yeah.
that too. She never
Oh
wanted to
yeah.
say, like, who she really was, which is so
Oh, that's too bad.
sad
I know
because we
that is
lose
sad.
so much.
And you don't know where you're from, and it's really important to know that. So,
Yep.
no, but for me, there was always this kind of voice in me somewhere wanting to reach out to that native side, even though I didn't know it was in me. And so when I went out to the West Coast and trained, got several degrees in like anthropology and political science. I was going to teach, and then I decided to go into the ministry, and I got ordained in the United Church, which is like kind of a liberal Protestant denomination. It's the largest Protestant church in Canada.
Okay.
And because I was raised in that church. And after a few stints in the East, I ended up in Port Alberni, 1992. That's a lumber town right in the middle of Vancouver Island on
Mhm.
the West Coast.
Yep.
And
Been there,
um,
played a few baseball tournaments
oh,
there.
yeah. I don't think most Americans would know where that is because they tend to be abysmally ignorant about Canada. But
Yep. So they are
yeah,
pretty much.
I know I'm half American, so I'm not putting down Yankees. My dad's from New Jersey. So anyway, um, But anyway, I get out there and I was hired by a really quite a dying congregation. They wanted me to bring in new blood. So I did that. And I went out and started inviting the Indians in. And the very first home I was in, the man who I was having tea with and talking, he said his best friend had been killed in the local residential school that was run by the church I was working for, the United Church.
Oh,
Along the Catholics, the Anglicans, and the United Church all ran these things
right.
for over 120 years, and even their own statistics show that half the children died in them. Now that's an enormous genocidal death rate. That's higher than the death rate from the
Half.
slave trade or the Black Death in Europe. I mean, it's enormous, and it
Yeah.
shows that it was an intent to wipe these kids out. So, um, I began to hear these stories. I began to invite them into my church. I let people speak from my pulpit, and that's when we began to hear these stories. But then the church, the boot came down pretty quick when the people began suing the churches, and they realized that I was working with these folks that could damage them. So I was fired without cause.
Right, conflict of interest.
Yeah, well, the typical way you treat a whistleblower, you go after their family. They went to my wife and offered to pay for her divorce if she'd leave me, and she did. Um, Lost custody of my children, was forced into poverty and blacklisting for many years because I didn't give up. I kept working with the survivors who came to me more. After I got thrown out of the church, my credibility went up a lot
Right.
in the
Right.
Aboriginal world. So we started a whole movement that eventually culminated in the Canadian government admitting this in 2008. They had
Wow.
like an official apology, although they covered up a lot. They said, yeah, well, it's true some children died, but it wasn't deliberate. Well, then half of them dying has to be deliberate. It isn't just some accident.
Yeah.
But a lot was covered up. They had a bogus, they called it a Truth and Reconciliation Commission inquiry, but you weren't allowed to take down evidence of any reference to a dead child. The churches were exonerated. Nobody ever went to jail. It was a huge cover up, but that escalated into a whole global movement. I got invited over to Europe around the same time. We started a tribunal to look into crimes of church and state. Eventually, a common law court trial that helped depose Pope Benedict and three other top cardinals of the Catholic Church in
Right.
2013. So it's had an enormous effect. And I sometimes wonder, like, how and why it all happened because I didn't expect any of this. But I think if you're standing on the truth and you don't give up, it leads to real miracles. And that's what I'd say to people these days. Don't feel despair by all this. If you know what's right, just stand on the truth and don't give up. Right.
Right. Right. It's fascinating to me how much power the church still has today. I was
Well,
watching I was
yeah.
watching this morning that Catholic preacher was preaching from the pulpit about um, Black Lives Matter this morning.
Well, that's interesting because the church receive, whether it's Catholic Church or anyone, they receive tax exempt status under the law by not being political. They're not allowed to make political comments from the
Right.
pulpit. And of course, the Catholic Church does that all the time. They say, don't vote for this congressman. They support abortion, that kind of thing, right?
Hmm.
Um, which is kind of an odd remark for the Catholic Church to make, since more children have died at their hands than a lot of institutions.
Right.
The history of this, but the thing is about all that, churches and governments historically have been partners in these crimes,
Yeah.
and they're protecting each other. And I found that looking
Right.
through a lot of the documents. And by the way, you can read all this stuff online, murderbydecree.com. That's kind of where all my evidence over 25 years is listed.
Yeah, which is an amazing website, by the way. It's great.
And in there they show in writing all of these things that are going on. I mean, policies even that when children are harmed, it's to be covered up. There's still that standing policy in the Catholic Church to do that, right?
Right.
So yeah, there's collusion at every level. And what do you the kind of the bigger question is, how do you fight crimes when the criminals are still in power? You know?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like the the average person wants separation of church and state today, right? You ask
Right.
them, oh, it's definitely,
Yeah.
and I would say less people are more open with their choice of religion, but
Hmm.
yet this force still carries so
Yeah.
much power in our
I know.
society.
Well, when you think about it, way small numbers of people rule is by keeping the majority in fear and divided and ignorant. And what better means of fear than to say you're going to get struck down by God if you do this or that? I mean,
Right. Oh,
religion as we've known
don't
it,
don't we
you know,
know fear
yeah,
is, I mean,
very
what's
much,
happening right
yeah,
now?
very much. And so people are raised with that, deferring to others all the time. When we've been forming these common law assemblies that have actually passed local bylaws saying the COVID regulations are illegal
Yeah.
and people are not to, abide by them.
Mhm.
And those who try to impose them are committing a crime, right?
Right.
And can be fined and jailed the whole bit. Now, when we say that to people, they say, "You mean we can do that?" And I said, "Well, yeah, because you're born sovereign and free, and you create governments." And I mean, the Americans already are raised with that idea, but in Canada, it's a treasonable idea,
Yes. Yes,
And
I've
so,
noticed that being
yeah,
Canadian and growing up
yeah,
in Canada and then moving to the States, I can see a fundamental difference between
yeah,
the 2 cultures.
yeah,
In Canada, the government's there to help you, to
mhm,
protect you, to make things run smoothly. In America, question the government.
yeah,
They're
exactly,
they don't
yeah,
trust anybody, and with rightfully so. I mean, it's like a very high percentage, like 61 or to 80% of people believe that Kennedy was assassinated by their government.
yeah, yeah.
And so, like, why would you just trust them?
It is a very different idea, and America was founded on the principle that just because you vote, just because you're part of a system, doesn't mean you surrender your sovereignty. You
Right.
can withdraw at any point. And whereas we in Canada, they come out of the British colonial system of no, the ruler knows. It goes back to Roman law, really. The ruler knows what's best for you. He gives you rights, but he can take them away at any point. Whereas the U.S. Constitution says Congress will enact no law that violates these fundamental liberties.
Right.
You can pass laws, but they're unconstitutional and they can be
Right.
struck down in a court, right? You don't have that in Canada. You go along or you're in trouble, you know.
Right. So I want to get into that. I want to get
Yeah.
into COVID with you and what you're doing with creating these common assemblies over there. So
Mhm.
can you tell me what is your experience so far in BC with terms of the virus? Can you take me through a bit of a timeline, what you've seen happen?
Well, of course, like everywhere, it started in March,
Hmm.
and it started in a very kind of low key way, saying, these measures we're going to look at. Like it wasn't just declared; it was done subtly,
Yes.
and yet distancing was brought in immediately. Masking wasn't right away, but there was all the propaganda going on about how the increasing pandemic all over the world, and BC is susceptible because there's ports and
Right,
a
and
lot of a big
American numbers, I've noticed that,
yeah.
there's because it is my belief that our numbers are not even close to right. They're being so
Oh
inflated
yeah,
and
yeah.
just there's so much they're just not true. I don't know what our numbers are, but I know they aren't what they're reporting.
Oh yeah, and then that's been shown already that there's no effective test
Test.
for it anyway, right?
That's right.
So you don't even know what you're dealing with. So,
Yep.
but what did happen very soon in Canada, especially in the West Coast, in British Columbia, was the government indemnified themselves. They did what the big pharmaceutical companies did in the 80s and 90s, and that was you cannot sue them for anything. And the courts closed almost immediately.
How
Now
did they
that's an
do that?
admission.
How did they
Oh,
do that?
they brought in an act. Now it happened nationally. The Trudeau government closed down Parliament almost immediately, with
Right.
not even a 10% quorum. 32 members of Parliament out of 338 just shut it down.
Wow.
And after that, they gave what's called the Privy Council, which is this colonial body of a few bureaucrats and the Governor General. They have now the power to pass any law they want and tax. One of the last things they did before they closed Parliament was they gave the Privy Council the power to tax without consent, without
What?
Parliament being revoked. Now, that was an issue that created the English Civil War in the 1600s when the king was taxing without even calling Parliament. Yet here we go 400 and some odd years later, and they're doing it again. So
How
it's
big is that group that's been designated?
Privy Council is 4 or 5 people. They pass most of the laws anyway in Canada. They're never
Okay.
debated in Parliament. It's like an old boys club kind of arrangement. But they did that right away. The courts all closed, so it was obviously designed to, forestall any kind of legal response by people to say this
Right.
stuff is illegal. No more
Right.
courts. So we had a outcry all over the country saying we got to do something. So we said, well, then we'll form our own assemblies, out of which can form common law courts.
Right.
And that idea initially was unfamiliar to people, but now it's spread like wildfire. I mean,
Yes.
I get hundreds and hundreds of emails every week now of people wanting to do the same thing, mostly in
Right.
Canada, right?
Okay, so what is a common law assembly?
It's 12 or more people who sign a charter, and it says we are a self-governing body in the community to defend the interest of this community. So it isn't like something for a whole region. It's really in one neighborhood or even like a city.
Okay, so
Um,
you do have to be in close proximity to
yes,
each other? Okay.
yes, that's the whole point, to be able to
Okay.
protect each other and see each other. And um, it's the power of that is that one another. You even know the local police and can get them on board with this. And we've done that. We brought them to our training workshops in that on the common law. But the assembly can then issue their own laws, and in fact, that's the purpose of it, to
Right.
debate laws and pass them and enforce them with their own sheriffs. Um, and it doesn't have to be only 12 people. You need 12 to start. That's the old common law tradition, like why you have 12 in a jury. 12
Ah,
men and women together can know the truth, and they have authority. Their decision is binding, whether it's in law, in politics, whatever. It's like
because you're
a
born
government.
free and sovereign.
Yes, and you can govern yourself. That's the point. Now, um, we're putting into practice the notion of a republic, and that's really what a republic is. When people govern themselves, you don't have a representative somewhere thousands of miles away speaking for you.
Right.
It's got to be local, and it's got to be direct democracy. So um, that's especially important in Canada, where every member of parliament takes an oath of allegiance to Queen Elizabeth and her descendants and nobody else. So they're
Wow.
servants of a foreign monarch, which is totally undemocratic and unlawful.
Right.
Um, so it's really reviving or creating the notion of a republic. And we had our attempt at 1776 in Canada. There was a rebellion in Eastern Canada in 1837 that got crushed. And, you know, but we're reviving that idea. And as a matter of fact, 5 years ago in Winnipeg, in central Canada, there was an assembly of people who voted to set up a framework for a republic. We call it the Republic of Canada.
Yeah.
And it's providing kind of the umbrella for a lot of this work, because we say ultimately, we've got to extend this to the whole country
Right.
and get rid of the whole crown colonial tradition, and which has led to a lot of these crimes. And 58% of Canadians want that. In an opinion poll
Wow.
4 years ago, they want no more ties with the British monarchy.
Right.
So it's really a potentially massive movement, and it's taking flesh in these local assemblies.
So just to clarify, it looks like this: the Republic of Canada is on top, and then all the common law assemblies kind of are underneath all of them, all of or under Canada. Correct?
Well, it's the other way around. Canada is going to arise from the grassroots. It's
I
not
see.
something being imposed. It's like eventually these local assemblies when we have practice in passing laws and governing ourselves, we'll eventually form a republic out of that. But
I see. I see.
it's from the grassroots up
So
rather
the
than
more common
yeah.
assemblies you have,
Yes,
it will turn into the
that's right.
republic.
That's what our aim is. Yeah.
Nice. So let's talk about the restrictions a little bit.
Yep.
They're unlawful
Mhm.
from your perspective, correct?
There's no court of order or allowing it. There's no act of parliament. They're just declarations from different government ministries, like the health ministry. Um,
Okay. And
and they often
they don't have the authority to make a law.
they don't have authority and they can't enforce them. They continually say you have to mask, but we can't enforce that. And that's their way of saying this is illegal, but they don't want to use that word.
Right. Has anyone been reprimanded legally?
Um,
Arrested,
oh
fined?
yeah,
Oh, they have.
yeah. They have. You mean for not going along with the
Yeah.
regulations?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. The media will regularly describe like a woman wouldn't mask, and then they held her down at gunpoint. Now these stories are designed to get people afraid.
Uh,
Um, so whether or not they actually happen, the point is they make like what happened to me when they threw me out of the church, and I was defrocked in the only public defrocking of a clergyman in United Church history. Like you create a public show trial.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. I'm proud of that fact actually. Um,
Exactly.
of a genocidal church. Yeah, I'm proud to have been tossed out. But
Yep.
the point is, they normally don't do that. You wash your dirty laundry in public when you want to make an example of somebody and scare
Mm,
everyone off.
right.
And that was
Like these
happening right.
videos that are surfacing from Australia?
Right. Right. You have to keep people ramped up in a state of fear, as you know from the whole 9/11 experience.
Mhm.
And they're pretty adept at doing that because people are already in a very frightened state of mind, very
Right.
uncertain of what's going on. So to ground people again and say, don't like keep looking at those images, just
Right.
know the truth in yourself and what do you need in your community? What do your children need? Especially with schools opening and the threat of quarantining children. This is a big concern for a lot of
Yeah,
people.
so I wanted to talk about that for
Yeah.
sure because I can't find any information online about that. And there hasn't been a whole lot of information distributed to parents about
No.
what will happen. So here in the States, schools have opened in some areas. I homeschool my kids, so they're not
Mm,
at school.
mm,
Um, because right now they're taking temperatures at school
right.
and they're quarantining, but if someone gets a positive test, then they're dealing with presumptive cases as well, saying, well, they're presuming that
Right.
they're positive, which
That's an
I don't.
illegal act right there.
And so they're quarantining, but they're not giving detail on protocol. What if, because they have these face scanners to go in and out of classrooms at school so that they can temp the kids. So
Oh,
what
you're
if
kidding me.
some
Oh
Mhm.
boy.
Yep. And so, and those are actually all over the states now. So you can't go into a public area without getting your face into an iPad to
Oh boy.
temp
Yeah.
you.
Hmm.
And if you temp high, nobody's saying what happens when you temp high.
So they have no screening whereby, well, what if I just have some other thing causing a
Oh,
high
I don't think
temperature?
there's any
There's no,
other
no,
reason
it's
to have a
ridiculous.
temperature right
No,
now other than COVID, right? I mean, really.
no.
So these kids are being quarantined. I don't know. It's not saying where they're being quarantined, if they test positive, if the teacher tests positive. I don't know. And I know that there's a lot of concern in BC right now as schools are
Yeah.
getting ready to get back.
Well, we
That
know that, yeah, there's two things we know. We've been talking to teachers and principal, and they all say the same thing. We don't know. We'll have more information. Now, I think that that's not accurate. They're just being fed a line to tell people about that.
okay.
Uh, the other thing we know is there was a company that gave bribes to the Prime Minister Trudeau's cabinet, and the Prime Minister was about to be brought to trial for that, and then
So I've heard.
conveniently, COVID came along. But the same company is called SNC Lavalin in Quebec. In Ontario, apparently they received a contract to build quarantine facilities in schools, and we're
In
trying to see
schools.
in the schools to actually hold children in the schools until parents agreed to have them and themselves vaccinated. So it's kind of a lever. Um, Now, don't forget that whole presumption.
Mhm.
It's illegal to even say that because there's a thing called the Nuremberg Standards in 1947. it came out of the doctors' trials at Nuremberg, where these Nazi doctors were experimenting on people in the death camps.
Yep.
And in fact, then came over to Canada and the US and kept doing the same thing after the war. That's a whole other
Right.
story. But anyway, it's
Paperclip.
the Project Paperclip, yeah.
Yep.
But anyway, the Nuremberg Principles in 1947, the passed binding all nations who are members of the UN, said that the principle of free, informed consent governs all medical procedures, no exceptions.
And
You
that's in
have
the
to have,
Nuremberg standards of 1947.
yeah, I can send you the link to that.
Okay.
Of course, it might be disappearing rapidly from the internet, but it is a law passed that's been binding on all nations. And what it says basically is that if you haven't been given full information and you're being coerced in any way, you don't have to agree. In fact, it's illegal for you to agree to those principles. And we haven't been given informed consent. I mean, we haven't been
No.
informed of the truth at all. We've been misinformed at every level.
We haven't been
So that's what
informed
they're
about
doing. Is really a criminal
vaccines.
conspiracy.
We
No,
haven't been informed on vaccines for over 30 years. There's an
that's right.
insert
And
that comes with a vaccine that lists a myriad of side effects,
right.
and we're never informed of those.
No, and you know what's astounding is how quickly people forget. Remember during the swine flu thing, the H1N1 scare a number of years ago, they had a Novartis. He was the head of research for Novartis. I forget his name. It's one of the big pharma companies that were
Hmm.
pushing the Tamiflu drug. He kind of laughingly, he was talking after the fact, and he said, "Oh, that was just an angst campaign. We call it in the corporate world. You get everybody afraid, and of course they pay off the big pharma is one of the biggest lobbyists in Washington.
Oh,
They just pay
the
off the
biggest probably.
politicians,
Yeah.
right?" And they wanted to boost corporate profits because there was a big merger happening. So they had to get everybody afraid. Now, when it's been proven that government and corporations work together like that just to make mega bucks,
Yep.
why would we believe again anything they ever say to us? But that's been down the memory hole. Everyone forgets that.
Right.
And the system is criminal. That's the point.
Yep.
There's a massive criminal conspiracy going on.
Hmm.
And that's why we've drawn the line and said, then we have to take back lawful authority, we the people.
Absolutely. I, if you look at the CDC website and you look at these agency websites, they appear like they're not being funded by private sector because they develop these nonprofits that actually
Right.
feed into them. So,
Hmm.
like the CDC Foundation is a nonprofit that fundraises through private sector. And if you start
Right.
looking at that list, well, it's just the commingling going on
Oh, yeah.
is
Of
easy to
course,
see.
that's been since the 80s in the whole Reagan Thatcher era.
Hmm.
Privatization began in a huge way. And a lot of the things that are called government agencies aren't anymore.
That's right.
One example is the Children's Aid Society in Canada is a private company. It's got a government logo, but it's a private company, and they get paid more than $50,000 for every child they grab out of a home and put in foster care
Wow.
homes or orphanages. So it's a child trafficking industry with government sanction. They even have the right to go in and seize children out of homes without a warrant or anything. So this is the society we live in. It's like for-profit prisons in America. The more
Yep.
people you lock up, the more
I
money you
know.
get. So
And that's a very
hey,
common misconception too over here is that prisons are not or private sector. People think
well,
that they're government
there,
run
well,
prisons,
there's
right?
a famous case about that. A judge back east somewhere was actually put in jail because he was colluding with these private companies running the prisons, and he was finding like 13, 14-year-olds, giving them
Yes,
prison time
I remember the case.
for kickbacks, right?
Yep.
And just
Yep.
breeds that.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think we're long overdue for a shift in
yeah,
this area.
yeah,
And people, it doesn't take much to really start looking into it when you follow the
yeah,
money to see
yeah,
who the benefactors are and
exactly.
why they'd be pushing the narrative that they're pushing,
Yeah, that's right.
right?
Yeah.
So, couple just, standard questions. So, the common law assemblies are totally legal,
Hmm.
right? And they're your right to form them.
That's right, because it's an old tradition in the English common law system that the people have the right to, and it's recognized in international law. They're called tribunals of conscience, like what we did in Europe when we put the Pope on trial
Right.
and the Crown of England for genocide. Um, these tribunals set up by citizens have lawful standing, and in fact, the verdicts can be acted on by other courts. They can issue arrest warrants from a verdict of a citizen's inquiry. The grand jury system in America is based on that idea. It's being called like a fourth arm of government, where the grand jury monitors the courts
Right.
and has the right to do an investigation, say these charges have to be brought, right?
Right.
And so that idea really is behind a lot of what we're doing, that when 12 or more people decide to do something and they sign a charter, they're a government in miniature, and it's totally lawful and legal, and their orders have standing. And if police don't enforce those orders, they're obstructing justice. And
Nice.
that's why we try to get the police on board. We try to
Right.
say, look, you're
Do you just
serving.
walk into the police station and tell them that you've assembled this common law, and now you're looking for their support?
We send it, with people we know. Everything is about relationships. So
Right.
especially in small towns where we tend to get more support than in big cities,
Right.
you already know the local cops. And of course, in America, you have that advantage of the local county sheriff, who's
Yep.
elected by the people, not by
Elected. That's
not
right.
accountable to the feds. Again, that goes back to Middle England in the Middle Ages, where you had the local shire community governing themselves, policing themselves, right?
Right.
And so these are all old traditions. It's nothing new or especially radical. It's just what we came out of, but people have forgotten that because they were never taught it really. You're never
That's
taught
right.
these things, right?
That's right. So maybe someone might think, do I have to give up my Canadian citizenship to become part of
No.
this? Okay.
No, it's kind of in transition. Obviously, we're not on the point where we can issue passports or replace it, but it's an idea that's growing up from the grassroots. And so we say to people, no, you don't have to give up your pension and all that. What's going to wreck your pension is more likely the system as it's operating now and your health
Right.
benefits and that. That's
Right.
what's a threat to it, not what we're doing. We're trying to reclaim that. I remember there was a study done, Wikipedia was this in 2017, that if you took all the wealth in Canada and divided it equally among 33 million people, everyone would get $248,000. That's the
Wow.
amount of wealth that's pumped out of Canada and its resources and everything.
Right.
I'm sure the number is even bigger in America. But, the point is there's no need for poverty and suffering in this country. It's just a matter of people take back their own power. One of the things we say to people is the assemblies should pass laws saying our taxes stay in the community, our tax money.
Right.
No more money to the federal government, because most of that tax money is used to pay off debts to foreign banks. It
Hmm.
doesn't go into essential services, or those are usual local or regional taxes that do that. So keep
Or
the money at
funding
home.
foreign interests, like,
Oh
the
yeah.
Canadian government funds the CDC as well,
Oh yeah.
as well as uh, Health Canada. So
Yeah.
like two streams coming in from taxpayers in Canada.
Well, Health Canada was the agency that seized Native children, put them in special hospitals, sterilized them, experimented on them for decades. You want to trust your children's health to that kind of agency? I
Right.
mean, you got to know the history
I
uh,
know. It's
to
so
know what's
hard though
happening
for
now,
people
right?
to accept this as truth.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know, I
we
don't
can.
know what it's going to take at this point for people to really
Yeah.
start having some acceptance about where this is going.
Well, one of the things I've learned is if you tell something to someone that agrees with the way they look at the world, they don't need evidence. They just agree with you. Yeah, that's the way things are. But if you say something to them that challenges their whole view, you can provide all the evidence in the world, and it's
Yes.
not going to convince them, because it's a matter of attitude, how we look at ourselves, how we see ourselves in the world around us, and
Right.
that has to shift. There's
Right.
that cognitive dissonance that has to kick in, and people fight that tooth and nail to have to do that until they have to, and then sometimes it's too late once you've woken up, right?
Right. Right. Which is
So yeah.
this whole discussion about ethics and character comes into play. Just because something's a law doesn't make it right.
No,
you
that's
know
right.
and if you have any question about what's going on with the mandates and what's going on, then how can you possibly shame other people for not going along with it? And that's what
Right.
I'm seeing,
Yeah.
anger towards people who are
Oh
not
yeah.
complying, which is
Violence.
this is exactly the dynamic that works
Yeah.
for their desired outcome.
Well,
You just pit the population
yeah.
against each other.
Well, that's part of the purpose, of course. But um, Americans especially need to see these precedents. There was a famous case in the U.S. Supreme Court Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was Chief Justice until the 30s sometime, one of the most famous jurists in America, he said, statute without consent is not law and it's not binding on people. You need to consent to a statute from a government, and that's not law. A statute is just a rule or a regulation that the government brings in, usually to sustain itself, to raise money, whatever, right?
Right.
But if you don't consent to that, it has no authority over you. You have to
So
have consent.
what's consent? Just complying? Or is it
No,
like you have to sign
consent.
something?
No, consent has to be, it can't be implied. It can't be, oh, you haven't said anything, therefore you agree, like what they're saying, presumed consent. That's
Right.
bogus. Consent has to have these aspects. It has to be freely given, so no
Okay.
coercion. It has to be based on all the information,
Mm. There's a problem with
those three
that.
qualities. And if you haven't been given, it's like in a contract. If somebody's fraudulently entered into a contract with you, you can walk away at any point. Fraud negates all legal agreements.
Right.
That's basic to common law. Now, we've been defrauded. We have no obligation to obey any of this simply because we've been defrauded and haven't consulted, and we have a gun to our heads and the heads of
Right.
our children. So that's all of those grounds are, all of that is grounds to simply walk away from it all and say, no, we're reestablishing the rule of law in our assemblies. And that's the only place it's going to happen because the politicians are all on board with this.
Right.
It's a global
It
criminal
is a global.
conspiracy, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. And if you look deep enough, you can find different documentation about Agenda 2030, about how
Yeah.
it's inevitable that they're wanting to create a one world government.
Hmm.
So we're having a cash shortage here too. I don't know if you know that.
Hmm.
I don't, are you?
Yeah, there a number of ATMs are closing all over, and the food supply is being deliberately curtailed. A lot of the truck deliveries aren't happening. And
Yes.
when the cold weather comes, the theory is, or the idea is that they'll simply say, control the food supply, and if you want to get food, you got to be chipped
Right.
to get access to it. So one of the things we're doing is we work with farmers. There's 3 communities in British Columbia alone where we maintain independent food bases, communities, especially to get the children out of the cities. We need those backups now. I mean, it's happening now as we speak, these
Hmm.
things. So we that's a real priority for us to create those.
Are those co-ops?
Yeah, well, it's, in one case, this woman owns 300 acres and she's off the radar, and she's just gradually bringing up people there to help settle it and work the land with her. They've got big greenhouses.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, it takes hard work to do a farm, but you got,
It does.
those skills are needed to pass on because we have to be self-sufficient now, self-reliant.
That's right. And I live on 6 acres. I have a small farm. So
Yeah,
it is hard work,
yeah,
but
yeah.
it is very rewarding work.
Oh, well, yeah, yeah.
It's very
Especially with
rewarding.
children,
Yes,
they're meant to be on the land. They're not meant to go through all of this nonsense, and
that's
and
right.
be so afraid. I mean, think of the psychological damage that's being done. It's far worse than any virus would ever do. I mean, I can't go near my friends. We can't
Hmm.
even see their faces anymore. I mean, it's so dehumanizing. It's the most horrible thing we can imagine, right?
Yeah, it's the bubbles, the little
Oh, jeez.
cubicles they're building for these tiny little people.
No,
Um, and again, I can't, it's a 99% survival rate, and we haven't even seen death in children.
no, no. It's older people and immune compromised people, as everyone knows. So that simple fact to say, look, this is another agenda. It has nothing to do with an illness. It has to do with a global police state,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So under what bylaws, like what bylaws will you when your assembly comes together, there's 12 of
Mhm.
you, how do you construct the bylaws? Who gets to decide that? You decide collectively.
Yeah, anyone can introduce a law. We have workshops where we go over, how to write a law, legal references, just basic understanding of common law. Because a lot of people don't know this, and they doubt themselves that they can do these things.
That's right.
Um, so we, teach people how to do that. But then anyone can introduce a law. It's debated, amended, passed, and then we're expected to enforce it. But the thing is, in common law, everyone in the community is expected to enforce it. It isn't just some sheriffs and deputies. We all have responsibility to make this law real. And so, in some of the communities where they pass these bylaws on Vancouver Island, they've gone and given them to the authorities and the police and the city hall and that. And Yeah, mostly what they do is go to among people and say, here is the means by which you can resist this. You're standing on lawful ground. And what that does psychologically, you're not fighting the system anymore as one person. You have
Right.
the law and a community behind you. You have
Behind
the
you. Yeah.
assembly behind you, and you have to stand together or fall apart individually.
Right.
Right?
Is there a is there a certain number that you have to stay under to be an assembly?
You oh no, there's no limit on how many people can be in it. You just need 12 to launch it.
Okay.
And it's important to have things like a convener, somebody to bring the, and a secretary, those administrative
Right.
things.
Like any kind
Um,
of board.
right, and a
Yeah.
sheriff to organize security and that. But one of the things people set up right away is what we call like an urgent response network, so that if anyone is targeted or the heat when the heat starts coming down, you can get 10, 20 people just showing up with cameras with as witnesses because we find from long experience that police and others tend to back down when they see there's a crowd and when they
Right.
see witnesses, and that's very important. If we can't protect each other, it's really hard to go ahead in this kind of work, right?
Right. And so you anticipate some kind of hammer coming down on you guys.
The cop that we're concerned about is not the one with the uniform. It's the policeman in our own head that is the problem, because people tend to censor themselves and say, I can't do this, I'm too afraid to do this, I might get in trouble.
Right.
That's
Right.
the cop we're concerned about. The policemen in the community are fathers, their husbands, they can be appealed to. This is really a fight for hearts and minds, and a lot of people come over, when you just use reason and respect with them and talk to them the truth.
Mhm.
That has a great power. The high ground, we've got the high ground on this and we have to keep it,
Right.
right?
Right. So just so I understand it, if you have your own sheriff in the common law, then are all these outside services still available to you?
Yeah, the thing is, we're not fighting the system. We're getting the system on board, kind of realigned with the way they should be, right?
Right.
And so we make appeal all the time. I remember I was just at an assembly meeting last night, and there's one woman was sitting there looking very somber and really thoughtful, and she came up to me after. He said, "I work for City Hall. I'm going to start talking to people about this." Right there, you
Wow.
go. I mean, that's the thing that the authorities and people behind all of this dictatorship are worried about is for those kinds of divisions to start within their own ranks,
Yeah.
and that's when they start falling out when that happens. So we've got to really encourage anyone in the system to come forward and work with us, give us information. And in our campaign to expose genocide, that happened a lot. I used to get calls from cops, politicians, lawyers, people in the church. Oh, I don't want to come out and I don't want to lose my pension, but here, you should know this, right? And they shared information. There's a
Right.
lot of people of goodwill all through the society, right? We have
Right.
to appeal to
Just
them, right?
not wanting to lose what they have or not wanting
Yeah,
to go through.
that's
But
right.
the thing that drives me crazy is we all do it. Then there
Right.
is no target.
Yeah.
It's like a tug of war. We're pulling on the rope, but if
Yeah.
everyone just let go, there wouldn't be a problem,
No, they wouldn't. But,
which is so
it's
ironic.
it is, but, it's like, again, the notion of common law is that we don't need people to teach us anything. We have the truth within ourselves, right?
Yeah.
That's what Thomas Jefferson meant when he said these truths are self-evident,
Yeah.
not taught to us. We just know them naturally,
Yeah.
common reason, common sense.
It's hard to get people to believe in that inner voice, because for me, I'm not masking. I haven't masked.
No,
When we first went into quarantine over here, I didn't have enough data. I didn't know what was happening. So I
right.
did mask when they were telling us we needed to flatten the curve and slow, the hospital workers' volume down. That was the
Mhm,
intent of masking. Even though at that point, when I did my research, it still didn't really make sense because of the fact that this
mhm.
cotton piece is not going to stop a virus from getting
No, of
past
course
it.
not.
No.
No.
So even then, but I thought, okay, well, I'll just do this at first. And then when the mask became mandatory here, um, I just haven't masked because I
Good.
know the facts around it. And
Yes.
but more importantly is my inner voice absolutely rejects it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely rejects it. It's like
Mhm.
it feels like just it's wrong.
Right.
It's just wrong from my core that this is leading somewhere
Right.
not good. And I think a lot of people, especially women, feel that way. I think they do. I think they just dismiss it as, well, they women are a great target to campaign to for,
Oh yeah,
help everybody,
right,
right? Do the right thing. You want to protect these slogans
right.
out of control over here. I don't know if, if you're hearing the slogans, stay home,
Oh
save
yeah.
lives. My mask
Oh
isn't
yeah,
for
but
me, it's
it
for
works.
you.
It works the other way too. Like I don't know if you can see this card. It's a medical exemption card,
Nice.
and it's put out by doctors in Ontario, but it also sponsored by a group called MAD, Mothers Against Distancing. And
I like
they go around and they say, no, we're not going to be distanced from each other. It's damaging our kids psychologically to do
Yeah.
that. So they're just appealing on a totally non-political basis to mothers everywhere to just
Yeah.
use common sense and their love for their children
Yeah.
to say, nope, we're not going along with this.
That's right. That's right. And you know, I don't know. I just think that history, right? Like there's an attack on history right now as well. If you know, I collect natural health books, and some of these books that I've been kind of putting off buying, I'll get that one later. They've quadrupled in price.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's like masks in the store were once 199, now they're 14.99, right? I wonder, it'd be
Yeah,
interesting to trace who owns the companies that produce the masks. Probably Big Pharma somewhere, probably a subsidiary of Big Pharma.
right. Well, and one governor over here, the governor of California, purchased, millions and millions of masks, and then made a mask mandate.
Oh, of course. His wife happens to be the CEO or something.
Right? It's not even
Same old
funny
game.
at this point.
Same old
It's
game.
so easily it's so easy to connect the dots now,
Right.
So, what does a day in the life in the republic look like
Well, for me or for anyone?
for anyone?
Because,
I want to give
well,
people a sense of, because
okay.
this whole thing seems weird, right? Like this is weird. This is I just want to live my life. I think that's the way people are thinking about
Yeah,
what's
they
going
want to
on.
they want to go back to what's they saw was normal.
Right.
But first of all, it wasn't normal. There was
Right.
always this stuff going on. It just didn't affect us, like I
That's right.
mentioned about the Indians
That's
and
right.
that. Now, I got to say to people that you won't go back to normal because they're not going to reopen government and the courts. This is a new society they're imposing, a corporatocracy where there is no accountability, and it's tyranny at every level, right?
What will
And
they
so,
use to not reopen the government? What will they say to the people?
well, they'll create a lot of smoke and mirrors like they always do. Um, Probably an extended national emergency of some kind, you know. Um, but in America, of course, state by state, there's states have a lot more power and autonomy than in Canada
Right.
and in provinces. But so I don't know if there'll be one. There could be different ways they go about that. But the point is that people have to awaken to the fact that it's up to us. It's not going to come from anywhere else.
Yeah.
And day in the life, people there needs to be more of a day in the life because right now people are still going about their lives like they don't have to live in a new way, and they do.
Right.
They have to have a new priority in their life, and that is, I can give you one example that in Winnipeg, where I'm from, one of the first assemblies was formed there, and most of the people there now they spend their days going around and trying to make their own neighborhood better, right?
Mm,
Canvassing people, what changes do you want? Come out to the assembly. What do we need? Daycare, homeschooling. They just work on the grassroots to build it from the bottom up,
right.
and it takes a lot to swim against the stream like that, right?
Yeah.
And
Are these
and
people
so,
still holding down jobs?
well, no, a lot of people aren't working now. Of course, the government is paying them not to work. You
Right.
can get $2,000 a month from the Canadian government, and that's just increasing dependency. And it's also deliberately crashing the economy. And I believe what's the bigger force here is that the Chinese, who are buying up the debt all over North America,
Mhm.
they're deliberately crashing the economy and are going to just own it all. The Trudeau government brought in a law allowing China to station troops on Canadian soil to protect their investments. I mean,
I
it's out
heard
and out
that.
treason, but I mean, this is some of the bigger political forces at work here in this, right? And
Yeah.
people need to be aware of all of that. And
Right. Does that allow them to have troops on Canadian soil?
yes,
Yeah.
anything to
Mm.
protect their investments. There's no limit on Chinese investment now in Canada. They can buy up the whole thing if they want. Again, thanks to the Trudeau government. I mean, it's you know, Canada's always been like that. It's been a big resource, you know, trough for the British, the Americans, now the Chinese. I mean, it's the same game, but it's bigger stakes now, and
Right.
I think we all know that.
So there's like 40 common law assemblies that are in existence right now,
It's more than that now.
it's more than
From
that.
this, when we passed our bylaws in Vancouver Island, it was an enormous response. We had 60,000 hits on our YouTube posting in like one day,
Wow.
and I've got volunteers from 94 communities across the country wanting to organize assemblies. So it's really spreading, and we're trying to start the same thing in America from people I've known there over the years on other campaigns. And
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, no, it's really spreading. That's hopeful, you know.
That is hopeful. What are the first steps to start?
Well, we have various. I have a book, Common Law Training Manual. Actually, all of my books are on Amazon, unfortunately, because I don't like that corporation. But for now, if you just put
Right.
the name Kevin Annett, you'll see all my books. And two of the ones we use in Canada, there's the Case for Canada, which is a book about the Republic and the vision of a Republic, and then the Common Law Training Manual,
Mm-hmm.
which is what they use. They're even translating. I had a Zoom conversation with somebody in Russia who were translating my book and all excited about forming assemblies there.
Wow.
And you know, but that's the book. It lays out the philosophy of the common law, how you go about setting up courts and assemblies. It's kind of a how-to manual. But we have a lot of other material we share with people. We have a site, republicofcanada.ca,
Mm-hmm.
and
And
a
you
lot of
offer
that's on there.
support for people?
Yeah, we go out. I'm on the road a lot, and I go out and do training workshops and try to set up a local kind of core of people who are going to be the leadership to carry it on. And so, yeah, it's like I say, a very grassroots movement.
Yeah. And it protects, your sovereignty and your freedoms.
Yeah. You know, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that at noon, my time, I have a Zoom call with a group in British Columbia that are
Oh,
setting
that's
up a
okay. I'm
Congress. And
just
I
about done.
just realized the time, and I'm really sorry, but I hope we can do this again because there's a lot more to talk about. So,
Yeah, definitely. I have one final question for you, if you
yeah,
don't mind.
yeah.
What is the desired outcome with the assemblies?
Taking power back into our communities and reestablishing liberty and what we are meant to have, which is free, self-governing communities where children are safe and people are healthy and all the things we naturally want as human beings. We have to have the power to do that back in our hands. I think I remember one of the founding fathers said, "You can have a constitution, but if the courts aren't in the hands of the people, you will never have liberty." You know, the law itself has to serve people, not like what it does now. And
Right.
so that's part of the vision, but it's also up to people to create it themselves. That's the whole point.
Right. People are going to have to find the power within them.
Exactly.
Great. Well, that's a great place to end. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I
Thank
hope
you,
that we've
Ken.
shed some light on this and how people can take some power back.
Thank you so much.
Great. Have a great day.
You too.
If the naturally inspired movement makes sense to you, let's do this together and transform the medical model and help people take charge of their health. Learn more about how you can join the Naturally Inspired movement by going to naturallyinspiredadvocate.com or call me at 970-475-4862.